Hello, friends. Over the last couple of days, I've been doing some reading out of the Bible, but today I'm going to go ahead and read a random. I didn't go in order. Pulled a random story from Under God by Toby Mack and Michael Tate, and this is story number 14, and it's called "In a Class of Only One," about Ruby Bridges, and the date of this story is 1960. And I'll begin. It was the morning of November 6, 1960. Two big black limousines pulled up in front of William T. France Elementary School in New Orleans, where a large, angry crowd had gathered. Four husky U.S. federal marshals got out. Then, while sheltering her from the crowd with their own bodies, they helped a tiny black girl in a starched white dress get out of the car. Putting her carefully on the sidewalk, they turned her around, and with two marshals in front of her and two behind her, the procession climbed the steps and entered the school. It was Ruby Bridges' third day at her new school. On the first day, her mother, Lucille, had gone with Ruby and the federal marshals. The night before, she had told Ruby, "There might be a lot of people outside the school, but you don't need to be afraid. I'll be with you." Ruby saw the barricades and heard the people shouting, but thought it was the Mardi Gras carnival that takes place in New Orleans every year. That whole first day, Ruby and her mother sat behind the glass window of the principal's office and waited. No one spoke to them, but all day they watched as white parents came in and dragged their children out of the school. Finally, it was 3 o'clock and time to go home. The crowd outside was even bigger and louder than it had been that morning, but the marshals helped him get through it safely. That first afternoon, Ruby taught a friend a chant she had learned. 2, 4, 6, 8, we don't want to integrate. Neither of the little girls knew what the words meant, but they began to jump rope to it every day after school. On the second day, Ruby, her mother, and the marshals went to school again, marching together past the noisy, angry crowd. When they finally got into the building, Ruby's new teacher, Mrs. Henry, was there to greet them. Ruby noticed that the halls were quiet and asked if she was early, but Mrs. Henry said no. "You are right on time." Ruby later learned that the white children were not coming to school that day. Mrs. Henry escorted Ruby and her mother to a classroom on the second floor. There were lots of desks in the room, but no other children. Ruby's mother took a seat in the back. Ruby took a seat up front, and Mrs. Henry started to teach Ruby the alphabet. Mrs. Henry was young and white, and Ruby was uneasy at first. She had never spent time with a white person before. She spent the whole day in the classroom with Mrs. Henry. She couldn't go to the cafeteria or outside for recess. Federal marshals sat outside the door, guarding and protecting them. On the third morning, Ruby's mother told her she couldn't go to school with her. She had to work and look after Ruby's brothers and sister. Ruby remembers her mother assuring her, "The marshals will take good care of you, Ruby, now. And remember, if you get afraid, say your prayers. You can pray to God anytime, anywhere. He will always hear you." One of the federal marshals, Charles Burks, remembers those days. For a little girl, 6 years old, going into a strange school with four strange deputy marshals, a place she'd never been before, she showed a lot of courage. She never cried. She didn't whimper. She just marched along like a good little soldier. We were all very proud of her. Although the Supreme Court had outlawed school segregation in Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas in May 1954, the schools in the South had never complied with the new order. Finally, a federal judge decreed that Monday, November 14, 1960, would be the day black children in New Orleans would go to school with white children. 6 first graders were chosen to integrate the city's public school system. 3 were assigned to McDonough School, number 19. The 2 others assigned to Ruby School decided to stay in their old segregated schools, so Ruby would be going to William T. France alone. Ruby's family knew it would not be easy. They discussed it for weeks. They prayed about the decision, and in the end, they decided that despite the risks, they had to take the step forward, not just for their own children, but for all black children. An article in the November 28, 1960 issue of U.S. News and World Report gave the following statistics. On November 17th, 3 Negro girls and 1 white child were the only pupils present at McDonald School, number 19, which normally has 467 pupils. The other integrated Negro, Ruby, had the company of only 3 white children at William T. France School, which normally has 576 pupils. A few white families braved the protest and kept their children in school. Like Ruby, they had to walk through a mob of white people screaming obscenities, yelling threats, and waving their fists at them. But they weren't in Ruby's class, so she didn't see them. The first few days of integration were tense. Militant segregationists did not just protest the schools. They took to the streets in protest, and riots erupted all over the city. Whites assaulted blacks in broad daylight, and the blacks fought back, even though the NAACP urged them not to do so. Extra police were called in. Finally, by the end of the week, the worst of the street riots were over. Ruby's father, Avon, was fired from his service station job because customers were threatening to boycott the business if he remained there. But financial help was on the way. People from around the country who'd heard about Ruby on the news sent letters, gifts, and money. A neighbor gave Avon a job painting houses. Others babysat for the family and watched their house to keep away troublemakers. Ruby's family couldn't have made it without the help of their friends and neighbors. Mrs. Henry tried to explain integration to Ruby and why some people were against it. It's not easy for people to change once they have gotten used to living a certain way. Some of them don't know any better and they're afraid. But not everyone is like that. Ruby now recalls. Even though I was only 6, I knew what she meant. The people I passed every morning as I walked up the school steps were full of hate. They were white, but so was my teacher, who couldn't have been more different from them. She was one of the most loving people I had ever known. The greatest lesson I learned that year was in Mrs. Henry's class, was a lesson Dr. Martin Luther King tried to teach of us all. Never judge people by the color of their skin. God makes each of us unique in ways that go much deeper. About this time, Dr. Robert Coles, a trained child psychiatrist who specialized in helping children under stress, offered to help Ruby and her family during the most stressful time in their lives. He was amazed to find that Ruby and her family were upheld and sustained by a very real and profound peace. Mr. Coles marveled at Ruby's ability to withstand this kind of treatment and wondered where she got her emotional strength. Every week he would come to Ruby's home to visit and draw with her, and then he would ask her about her drawings. One day, Mrs. Henry, who always watched Ruby walk into the school, told Dr. Coles that Ruby had stopped and talked to the people in the street. When Dr. Coles asked Ruby about this, she said, "Oh yes, I told her I wasn't talking to them. I was just saying a prayer for them." Usually, Ruby prayed in the car on the way to school, but that day she had forgotten until she was in the middle of the crowd. Her mother had taught her that every time she felt afraid, she should pray. With childlike obedience, when Ruby felt afraid that morning, she stopped right where she was and said a prayer. Dr. Coles was amazed that Ruby would pray for people who were so hateful to her, and he asked her, "Ruby, you pray for these people there?" "Oh, yes." "Why do you do that?" "Because they need praying for," Ruby replied. "Ruby, why do you think they need you to pray for them?" "Because I should." Ruby's mother heard this exchange and explained, "We tell Ruby that it's important that she pray for the people." Dr. Coles asked Ruby what she prayed, and Ruby answered, "I pray for me, that I should be strong and not afraid. I pray for my enemies, that God would forgive them." Jesus prayed that on the cross, she told Coles, as if that settled the matter. Forgive them because they don't know what they're doing. For the rest of the Jesus prayed that on the cross, she told Coles, as if that settled the matter. Forgive them because they don't know what they're doing. For the rest of the year, Mrs. Henry stubbornly taught her class of one. Mrs. Henry said, I grew to love Ruby and to be awed by her. It was an ugly world outside. Neither of us ever missed a single day of school that year. It was important to keep going. Sometime in the spring, Mrs. Henry was stunned to find out 4 other first graders had been coming to the school for a while. She immediately told the principal she wanted Ruby and the other first graders to be together, as it was cruel to keep Ruby by herself for so long. She said, by law, you have to integrate this school. Integration means putting black and white children in the same classroom. As I see it, you are breaking the law by keeping them separate. The principal would not force the other first grade teacher to include Ruby in her class. Instead, the white children came into Mrs. Henry's classroom for part of each day, and Mrs. Henry said it was progress. It was from these children that Ruby finally learned about racism and integration. And she said, I had picked up bits and pieces over the months from being around adults and hearing them talk, but nothing was clear to me. The light dawned one day when a little white boy refused to play with me. I can't play with you, the boy said. My mama said not to because you're a in blank, 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 R. At that moment, it all made sense to me. I finally realized that everything had happened because I was black. I remember feeling a little stunned. It was all about the color of my skin. I wasn't angry at the boy because I understood. His mother had told him not to play with me, and he was obeying her. I would have done the same thing. If my mama said not to do something, I didn't do it. By late spring, the crowd outside dwindled to just a few protesters. Instead of the federal marshals, a taxi driver was sent to pick Ruby up every morning. Before she knew it, it was June. When Ruby went back to school in September, everything was different. There were no marshals and no protesters. There were other kids, even some black students, in her second grade class. It was odd, but it was almost as if that first year of school integration had never happened. No one talked about it. Everyone seemed to have put that difficult time behind them. Today, Ruby Bridges lives in New Orleans with her husband, Malcolm Hall, and 4 sons. In the early 1990s, Ruby volunteered to work at the same William Frantz Elementary School she had integrated as a child. It had since become an inner city school with mostly African American students, so the children were segregated once again. Eventually, Ruby established the Ruby Bridges Foundation to help schools succeed. Ruby often speaks to audiences across the U.S., telling them that every child is a unique human being fashioned by God, and that schools can be a place to bring kids together from all races and backgrounds. And she said, if kids of different races are to grow up to live and work together in harmony, then they are going to have to begin at the beginning, in school together. People are touched by the story of the black child who was so alone. In all of this, I feel my part is just to trust in the Lord and step out of the way. For many years, I wasn't ready to be who I am today, but I've always tried not to lose my faith. Now I feel I'm being led by just that, faith. I don't know where events will go from here, but I feel carried along by something bigger than I am. A couple of quotes for you. Ruby had been called by her country to perform an act of profound bravery to become the only black child in all white school. By her simple act of courage, Ruby moved the hearts and opened the minds of millions of people. A civil rights worker. Another quote. There is no easy way to create a world where men and women can live together, where each has his own job and house, and where all children receive as much education as minds can absorb. But if such a world is created in our lifetime, it will be done in the United States by Negroes and white people of goodwill. It will be accomplished by persons who have the courage to put an end to suffering by willingly suffering themselves rather than inflict suffering upon others. It will be done by rejecting the racism, materialism, and violence that has characterized Western civilizations, and especially by working toward a world of brotherhood, cooperation, and peace. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And then finally, racism is a grown-up disease, and we must stop using our children to spread it. Ruby Bridges. And so, yesterday was Easter Sunday, and I was at my son's house. We were getting ready to go fishing. And I was talking to someone. I won't say names. I won't go into that. But we were having a discussion about our politics, about what's going on in our country right now. And he used the N-word. So racism is not dead in our country. And it stunned me to hear that, but I guess I should not have been surprised. This man was in his late 60s. He grew up in that era and in that part of the world where segregation was still being fought. And I am very thankful that I was brought up in a way that took me away from that segregated thinking. And I'm not sure how, I guess I would have turned out the way I am anyway, simply because of the way I was born, the way I was created. I was not created to be closed-minded in my thinking. I know that. And I experienced racism. They tried to indoctrinate me to be a racist at one point. My mother would not have stood for it. We had what we called a nanny. She was a paid black woman who came in to take care of me and my sister when Mama had to work because we were homeless for a while, and Mom finally got on her feet. We finally got a house, but she needed someone to take care of us. And she was the most loving person. And there were some hateful things that went on in there. And I brought some hateful things on her because of my indoctrination. And I quickly learned how dumb that was and how bad that was and how totally inhumane some of the things I said to her were when I was a young man. Because I was being indoctrinated in a certain place where we lived to not like black people. But I quickly learned later as we moved away from there, thank God. And by the way, one of my best friends was a guy named Keith Valentine. And he eventually, we couldn't be friends anymore because I was white. I mean, to give you an idea of how 180 that can be. And so, but we moved I went to an integrated high school, Thomas Jefferson High School, where it was 98% or so black. And I was shunned to some degree by black people. Racism sucks. And I believe it started back long ago in the times of the Bible. There was Cain and Abel, brothers and Brent's brother. There were tribes that were brought out of the time of creation. And there were tribes that were brought out at the time of Noah when things started all over again. Whole civilizations have been destroyed over racism and over religion and over hate. And this was in 1960. I mean, this book starts back before the Declaration of Independence, but the time was 1960 when we were trying to integrate in our country. That wasn't that long ago. What was it? I don't know, 50 some years, 60 years ago? 70 years ago. 70 years ago. And we have gotten to where we are today. We are amazing. When we first came here, we were mostly white people with slaves. Unfortunately, they were slaves. Ignorance. Ignorance caused slavery, stupidity, greed, whatever you want to call those things. It was an atrocity. We learned from that. We've gotten away from that thinking. There are still limited people who don't have the open-minded thinking that most of us do, but they're very few and far between. I just wanted to bring this message to you tonight. I love you. Most people love you. We are here to help heal. And when I read that part about Jesus on the cross and that little girl saying, "Forgive them for they know not what they do," we should all be touched to the core by those words. And whether you're a Christian or not, it doesn't matter. What matters is the acts of a man. It's not the color of his skin. It's not the so-called formal religion that he walks in, unless it's harmful to another human, and then it's not a religion, it's a hurt. So here's a challenge for you. Stop thinking about formal religion and just start thinking about lessons. Start thinking about the actions of people that they are bringing to you. This man, Jesus, was teaching pure love. He was teaching us how to get closer to being similar to our Creator, how to be in the likeness of our Creator by living honestly with omnipotence and pure love in our hearts to live our purpose, whatever that might be. And that the only way that you can truly find your purpose is to accept those basic principles. To try to live as honestly as you can with that connection with God, your omnipotence. And whether you want to call it God or you want to call it the universe or the matrix, call it what you want, but open your heart to it. That's what you call faith. Real faith. Not some fake faith that all of a sudden your life is going to be changed because you don't have any control. You do have control. You have responsibility and accountability. But when you read stories about little Miss Ruby and her little black self going to that little white school and not being afraid to go because she knows in her heart that she is supposed to be there, that she is a human being, an innocent little human being going to school. And who the hell are you white people to tell her she can't go? And who are you black people to tell me you won't be my friend because I'm white? And who are you Muslims to tell me that you can't love me because I happen to be a Christian? And Vicky Verky? These are the stupidest arguments on the planet. That is the dumbest thing we could ever... This is what keeps us torn apart. And it's the dumbest thing we could ever do to each other. There's no point in that bullshit. There's no point in it. Excuse my language. I'm sorry. Sometimes I slip. Love me, I love you. That's it. And things come together and get better. You know, when we talk about these progressive left, let's talk about that just for a minute and then I'll go. Progressive left. Progressive. Progress. Versus right-wing conservative. So let's talk about that just for a minute. If you will just bear with me for a minute. If you're a progressive, what does that really mean? I would say that making progress toward a unified humanity is probably a very good thing, wouldn't you say? And a conservative working toward a unified humanity is also a good thing. If we can't meet in a middle ground progressive movement and within conservative values, then what's the point in continuing this battle? And you in my opinion, humble as it may be, you go way too far progressive and you mutate the very word humanity into something that is a disgusting mass of stink. Because we have the ability to be a massive pile of stink. And I urge you to, we can't destroy history. We have to remember Hitler. We have to remember Stalin. We have to remember Mussolini. We have to remember Bill Clinton. We have to remember Nixon. We have to remember Venezuela. We have to remember Japan and the bombing of Pearl Harbor. We have to remember, you know what I'm saying. But we also have to remember Mozart. We also have to remember Jesus. We also have to remember all of the great people, George Washington. We have to remember Martin Luther King. We have to remember Donald Trump. We have to remember Bill Gates for the computer. We have to remember these great people who did great things. But we have to remember our humility. We have to remember to honestly assess what we're doing. Because if we get too progressive and we go outside the universal principles of honesty, omnipotence, pure love, and essence, we will become a mutated mess. And if we go too far to the conservative point where we're not progressing, then we stagnate and we do not move ourselves forward in a unified form to be able to feed the 30,000 that starve to death every day. One of the best things we could possibly do is head south and see what we can do with that triangle of countries down there that is causing their people to want to leave them so badly to come here. There couldn't be anything better than to do that. Anyway, that's all I'm going to have today. But we must remember the messages of the people who are trying to help us to overcome our problems of hatred and all the stuff that we have that's dark inside us. Because we have the ability to exercise our free will. But with the progressive thing, we need to help them to save our planet without destroying us in the process. We have to help them to feed the masses without destroying everything that is good about our conservative processes in our Constitution, because that's what makes us such a valuable country to begin with. So with that, I'll say goodbye and have a good night, and I'll see you next time. Love you. Bye.